You all know me. I love tabletop role-playing games from Japan, and I'm a piece of weeaboo trash that loves him some Japanese pop culture that makes you as unrespectable in the US as it does in Japan. Why else would I devote so much of my time to covering so many of the Big Eye Small Mouth and Tri-Stat System books? If not because I have a weakness for unusual tabletop role-playing games, and drawings of people with big, watery-eyed faces that practically have no nose or mouth to speak of. And if you don't know me, well, I've pretty much summed up what my biggest interests are, as well as why I don't have any friends, even among the two most repugnant groups of people you could imagine. I exaggerate on that last. I got my hands on a copy of Konosuba TRPG, a tabletop role-playing game adaptation of the fantasy anime of the same name. And surprisingly, it's not just a shameless reskin of Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, I'm kind of inclined to say that this game is more like a JRPG video game, but without the video game part, and thus, kind of what I expected games like Dungeons & Dragons to be like when I was first introduced to it at the age of 10. So, with all that said, let's take a little look inside the Konosuba TRPG, shall we? If you came into this video without knowing what Konosuba is, give me just a moment to rectify that. Konosuba is an anime that lampoons the isekai genre. Isekai being stories about somebody that winds up in another world, sometimes with some wild advantage that gives them the upper hand in their new home. Usually a person dies or has something weird happen to them that causes them to be reincarnated. And they then go through their new world becoming insanely overpowered, and from the get-go, Konosuba mocks that. Because the main character pointlessly and embarrassingly dies, gets sent to a fantasy world, and is offered to take one special cheat from the various ones he sees in a featureless room he's in before he gets to move on. So, he picks the goddess that's explaining what's going on. Things start ridiculous in this show, and they stay ridiculous. If you want to know how so, just go watch the show for yourself. I'm not here to review that, but rather the tabletop roleplay game that is a shameless cash grab for it. And don't worry, you don't need to be familiar with the show to enjoy this game, since the show also lampoons the fantasy genre as well, or at least Japan's take on it. Konosuba TRPG was originally published by Fear, Far East Amusement Research, and the English release was handled by Yen Press. Some of Fear's other works include Double Cross, Kamigakari, and Tenra Bancho Zero, which have also had English releases, albeit by different companies. Meanwhile, Yen Press released Konosuba TRPG alongside various other media that revolve around tabletop RPGs, such as the Goblin Slayer TRPG and the novel Make-You Labyrinth Kingdom. Goblin Slayer being another anime that was popular around the same time as Konosuba, and Make-You Kingdom being a tabletop RPG that was popular in Japan. All of which are games I have or will be covering soon. The rulebook for this weighs in at around 300 pages, the first 80 or so being what's known in Japan as a replay, a text transcript of people who've played the game. Many RPGs from Japan start with sections like this, and it's not uncommon for tabletop RPGs in Japan to have volumes upon volumes of replays published for a given game. Where we in the US have recordings of people playing tabletop RPGs that we watch or listen to on things like YouTube, Japan instead transcribes them and prints them in books. Meaning, in either country, it's not unusual for somebody to be a fan of a tabletop role-playing game they might have never otherwise played themselves. But I digress. A bulk of the book is various skills and equipment lists, so what you actually need to read to play this is pretty sparse. Everything else you can pretty easily refer to as needed. So get comfortable with the index and table of contents for this one, and familiarize yourself with the appendices. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into making a character for this game. If you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, or any other various fantasy role-playing games, tabletop or otherwise, character creation in this will feel somewhat familiar to you. You pick your character's race, which determines your starting stats and later in the process what skills are available to you. And after you figure out your starting stats, you get 5 more points to add to them. Also similar to D&D, your stat is used to determine your bonus with that stat, and the bonus is typically used more often than the stat itself. Your modifiers are equal to 1/3 of the stat rounded down. Let's also take a moment to go over the stats and what they mean real quick. First, you have strength, which is physical might, and this affects how much equipment you can carry. Then you have dexterity, which is your hand-eye coordination, and affects your likelihood of hitting a target when you're fighting them. Agility is your physical speed, which affects your ability to dodge when you're being hit, and also your turn order. Then you have intelligence, which is your advanced learning, and it affects things like wizard spellcasting. Perception is your character's ability to notice things and also affects your turn order. Mind is your mental fortitude and affects priest magic and magic defense. And last is luck, that je ne sais quoi I try to max out in any game that I play, video or otherwise. It also affects how many blessings you can use at one time. Your choice of class determines modifiers you gain to your stats, as well as how much HP and MP you have for every level beyond the first. The meat of Konosuba TRPG is your skills, which are comparable to feats or class features from Dungeons & Dragons. Though if you are unfamiliar with Dungeons & Dragons, skills cover all the unusual or exceptional things that your character is able to do. Most of the stat blocks for them are kind of self-explanatory, though page 122 gives you a detailed explanation of how it all works. At character creation, you pick one skill from your race that has the creation timing, then you pick 5 skills from your class list, and 2 from the general list. After you've done that, you next get 500 KE to pick out your character's starting equipment, with KE being the abbreviation for this game world's currency. Just think of it as gold if you need to. Bear in mind that each piece of equipment has class and level restrictions, and that it's your character's strength score, not bonus, that determines how much you're allowed to carry. And here is one of the places I'm led to believe the translators of this game messed up, or at least didn't provide the context that was needed given what they were translating. The passage on page 118 states that items equipped cannot exceed your strength score. And that's about it, as far as I can tell. I'll admit, I skimmed through this, so it may be hidden somewhere I overlooked. Which, just taking a little look at some of the item stat blocks, you can have a weapon, a complement of armor, or a few extra things, but not all 3 at once, which is a little wacky. So, this is something that warrants a little further investigation. If we take a look at the pre-made characters, we can see that they do have all 3 of these things, and in a few cases, it well exceeds their strength score. So, I did a little bit of digging in other games that I have access to, and in the game Arianrod, which me and a few friends believe that Konosuba TRPG is based on, there is an ample explanation. You have 3 different weight limits, one for your equipped weapon, one for your equipped armor and accessories, and the last one for any items that you're carrying. Which, this interpretation makes the weight values of everything and the pre-made characters make a lot more sense. The lesson to be learned here, pre-made characters from the official publisher are your friend. With that digression aside though, it's time for some final bookkeeping. Record that your character has 5 blessings, calculate your max HP and SP, which is based on this handy formula of your strength or your mind, depending on if it's HP or SP, plus your class's starting value, plus any from any skills that you have. You calculate your action points, which is your agility and perception, plus any bonuses from skills and penalties from equipment. This determines your character's turn order in combat. And your character is, at least, mechanically ready at this point. Worth noting is the background tables, which determine some of the story elements of your character. Think of these things as being similar to Ideal, Bond, and Flaw from Dungeons & Dragons 5e. This is the only real customization you get if you're using a pre-made character, but it doesn't mechanically affect anything. Incidentally, this is one thing I think Japan does better in terms of tabletop RPG design. Pre-made characters are a part of the core book. It's a minor difference from, say, having to go to a website to find them, but when you're confirming how character creation works, it's nice to have an end result ready for referencing. Pre-made characters in Konosuba have their stats already picked out for you. All you need to do is decide their background. Meaning, as long as your character's specific abilities aren't tied to your concept, you can quickly get a character together and fill it out with your own story ideas. Which, again, minor difference between a certain other fantasy RPG, but it's those minor differences that can ripple out fantastically. Anytime in Konosuba TRPG where your ability to accomplish something is called into question, you make what's called a check. You roll 2 6-sided dice, add the results together, and your relevant stat modifier. Then you compare it to a target number set by the GM, and you succeed if your number meets or beats the target number. Or, in some cases, the roll might be against another character making a similar dice roll. The most notable example of this is combat, where the attacker and defender both roll, add their respective attack or defensive modifiers, and whoever gets higher is the one who gets their way in the fight. An important note, if you roll and end up with 2 6s, your character automatically succeeds. But if all the dice you roll end up as 1s, you automatically fail. The skills your character picked up during creation can offer some variation to this process. And they do this either by modifying the end result of the roll somehow, or changing the amount of dice that you would roll. Which is why the wording regarding automatic successes and failures is so important. Having just 1 more dice makes it not only easier for you to get a critical, since you only need 2 of your 3 dice to be 6, it offers some protection against fumbles, where you would need all 3 of them to be 1. And the inverse is also true. Having only 1 die to roll means you cannot critical, since you need 2 6s, and that is impossible to get on 1 die. And all you need is just a single one to fumble. Which, for example, means you can easily create everybody's favorite masochistic knight, complete with her inability to be harmed or cause harm. Especially since there's a skill that can allow you to add 1 extra die to your dodge rolls, at the cost of literally everything else having 1 less die. Though, another way to get extra dice is to spend a point of blessing, the other use for blessings being that you can reroll a check entirely. Konosuba TRPG uses some familiar and not so familiar combat concepts. For the benefit of anybody who doesn't want to scan through hundreds of pages to find them out, I'll hit some high points here. There's a somewhat strict structure in Konosuba TRPG's combat phases. Certain skills can only be used during certain phases. On the one hand, this keeps things organized, no going back and saying, but what if I actually... The flip side, though, players definitely need to be aware of the phases and when they can use certain things. The phases are setup, which is the very first step in any combat round. The GM is expected to establish and clarify where things currently stand, and there's a few skills that players can use during this setup. Every character then goes through their initiative phase, which is the start of their turn, and their main phase, which is the meat of their turn. Worth noting, turn order is based on a character's action points. The highest goes first, then the next highest, and so on and so forth. For those coming in from Dungeons & Dragons, you do not need to roll to determine turn order. During the main phase, characters get a major and a minor action. Minor actions usually assist the character or hinder someone else, while major actions usually involve a check like attacking somebody by swinging a sword or throwing a fireball at them. After everybody has had their main phase, cleanup phase occurs, which is where status effects often get resolved. Konosuba takes an unusual approach with handling spacing and positioning during combat. Instead of using grids or hexes, things are instead measured as engagements. An engagement is basically an abstract zone where various characters are in each other's immediate vicinity, and it is thus difficult to move past or break away from it. There's no worrying about how many steps you can take or the range of their arm spans, etc., etc. If they're close, they're in an engagement, and if there's a lot of people nearby, that engagement gets bigger because it'll be harder to move around without getting struck by stray fists, swords, or explosions. One of the consequences of engagements is that area of effect skills don't need a bunch of geometric calculations to figure out if somebody can be just outside of the blast zone. Is that character in that tussle I'm chucking a fireball at? Yes? Okay, they get burned too. Unless the skill you're using also has the select targeting type, at which point you can pick and choose who does or does not get affected by the fireball. Last, some other odds and ends worth mentioning. There's 3 ways you can advance your character upon leveling up in Konosuba. First, and most simply, is you gain 3 new skill levels, be they class or racial. Additionally, they can choose to change their class, which allows them to pick 3 skills from either their previous or their new class. And finally, they can opt to gain only 2 skills from any of their relevant lists, but they gain an additional blessing. An important thing to note about changing classes. There are 4 advanced classes in Konosuba TRPG: Crusader, Archpriest, Archwizard, and Assassin. These have some special requirements before you can change into them. First, you need to be at least level 10 when you're changing. Second, you need to be changing from the basic version of the class you're moving into. So, only a warrior can become a Crusader, a priest an Archpriest, a wizard an Archwizard, or a thief to an Assassin. And if you feel so inclined to go from one advanced class to another, you first have to change into the new class's prerequisite class. For example, an Archpriest needs to become a thief before they can go back to being an Assassin. Also, upon leveling up, you pick 3 of your stats and increase them by 1, and then go through the bookkeeping of updating all your derived stats and modifiers. This game also includes cheats, which are optional rules that, frankly, are kind of game-breaking, much like the stuff you would find that the show is based on. Things like actually being a deity or being able to put up so much power into your abilities that it causes you to collapse when you're done. They always come with some manner of disadvantage, such as the aforementioned passing out after you've overcharged your abilities. Or, if you're a deity, no one will believe you. They're optional and game-breaking and can only be used if the GM says so. GMs, do not use them if you're uncomfortable with a bunch of utter nonsense in your games. But if you don't care about how utterly off the rails your game goes, well, the show Konosuba is pretty much based on that premise. The original script of this section had a lot of outside cultural context behind this game that made this section much longer than it needed to be. But after thinking about it, I don't often go too much into detail like that with many other games, so I axed it. Sticking with what's in the book, I'll start with where it misses the mark. There is very little in the way of illustration in this book, which is unfortunate since it uses the anime Konosuba as its big selling point. So if you're getting this for no other reason than you're a fan of the anime, you're not even getting a decent piece of Konosuba merchandise. And it's mostly a generic fantasy game with a few nods to the show added in, like your character's lifestyle being a piece of equipment you need to factor in money for. Which, that's the reason people play Shadowrun, right? Because budgeting for your month-to-month living expenses is so much fun, we want to do that in a tabletop game as well. And as a game, the options are still a little bit lackluster. But if you're not looking for novelty and don't care about the show it's based on, there's still some enjoyment to be had. Mostly because the show Konosuba is a parody of the shows where somebody ends up in a fantasy world. And it's a world that runs on video game logic, so you don't have to bend over backwards trying to figure out how stats and skills are represented in the world. Characters in the show literally have character sheets they can pull out, look over, and see what their stats are, and this comes up more than once. So metagaming actually makes sense in this setting. In fact, the Crimson Demon Clan are metagamers. It's canon. They strive to be the best at one thing and one thing only, to the exclusion of pretty much anything else. And this is also why the character Yun Yun is shunned by the rest of her clan, because she chose to be the best at being mid. Plus, mechanically, the game gives pretty ample freedom while sticking to the familiar concept of having character levels. Mostly because character creation and each level gives you so many points for raising or learning new skills, as opposed to deciding for you what you should have at any given level. And the game uses 2d6 as its base dice roll, which can only mean one thing. It has those bell curves I love oh so very much. So, is it worth getting? For fans of Konosuba with no interest in tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons, give this one a pass. It's better as an RPG than as Konosuba merchandise. But if you're new to tabletop role-playing games and have some curiosity, this is a good entry point. The first half of the book is a transcript of people who've played the game, so it shows what a typical game of Konosuba might look like. And if you're a fan of tabletop role-playing games, you can enjoy it without having to be a fan of the show. And it's different enough from the likes of Dungeons & Dragons that you can enjoy some of the novelty it offers. The one thing I have to say that disappoints me about Konosuba TRPG is this, though. It's a far cry from other games that Fear has published. Specifically, the game Audienrod is much better, and I in fact have good reason to believe that it's just a watered-down version of that. Still, I don't regret buying a copy of this. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful or interesting, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to hear about other fantasy RPGs or RPGs from Japan, take a look through my other videos or consider subscribing. With all that said, I am Aaron Derashero, and I will see you all next time.